Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And joining us this week is Susan Glasser, staff writer for The New Yorker. Susan, wonderful to have you back.
Thank you so much, Ivo.
Also joining us is Peter Spiegel, the U.S. managing editor of the Financial Times. Peter, great to see you again.
Thanks for having me back.
And James Harding, World Review, our editor and co-founder of Tortoise Media. James, great to have you join us from the United Kingdom.
Good to see you, Ivo. Thanks very much.
Well, a lot of great big issues to talk about, Susan. Let's start with Biden going Asia first. We've really had quite a week, starting with a Quad leaders meeting on Friday and continuing as we speak with talks between the United States and China in Anchorage, Alaska, and a lot of stuff in between. What do you take away from sort of this first big diplomatic effort on the part of the Biden administration?
Yeah, I think this is definitely sort of the first week that we see that new Biden foreign policy team in action. And, you had the first overseas trip by Secretary of State Tony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin traveling together, doing the kind of Japan, South Korea message to China. Well, we'll meet with you, but only before we consult with our allies, continuing to try to differentiate from the Trump foreign policy, while at the same time, in effect, continuing a pretty muscular approach in terms of, really distancing itself from China. And I'm fascinated to see what's unfolding really right before our eyes in terms of this meeting in Alaska. It's very interesting on the one hand that the Chinese agreed to come to U.S. territory for that first meeting. I do think that might have been a concession of sorts. And yet, then perhaps to counterbalance it, you have the Chinese opening what was supposed to be pro forma 2-minute opening statements. Instead, the Chinese begin with an 18-minute harangue of the two U.S. officials, which then leads to a very undiplomatic beginning. And this is China. It's not the Russians. We can talk about that war of words with Vladimir Putin as well, but it's not the Russians. I think that generally speaking, to have people who are so attuned to the nuances of international diplomacy, boom, starts off the Biden relationship with this kind of public confrontation. Very interesting, obviously not an accident, very purposeful. It comes because the day before, the new Biden team had put out a new set of sanctions related to the crackdown in Hong Kong. And again, we're only, I think, halfway through the 2 days worth of meetings. But what does it tell us in a big picture sense about the Biden foreign policy approach? First of all, certainly it's fair to say that continuing, as with Trump, the focus on this great power adversarial relationships and focus, I think, of U.S. foreign policy being on how to navigate the twin problems, not the same problems, but the twin problems of Russia and China. And so I do think that is clearly a focus of the team. Secondly, there's some sort of key question marks beyond the optics of reaching out to allies more and, sort of bending to the idea of partnership, whether it's with the Europeans in regards to Russia or people like the Japanese and the other members of the Quad in relation to China. You still have the question of what does it mean beyond good optics? And I still feel that I don't have a full answer on that. And then, of course, the other big question to me hanging over this China meeting does go to what the Biden administration will or won't do when it comes to trade and tariffs, which they've left on so far of China. I do think it's very clear that the Biden team is going to be very certainly forceful in their rhetoric when it comes to human rights issues, such as the Uyghurs. But it's not clear to me what their approach is going to be on the trade piece. So I'll leave it there. But I do think it's the biggest week we've had yet so far of the new Biden team when it comes to foreign policy.
Ivo, if I could just jump in on Susan's last point, because that was what struck me the most. It was I mean, I love the use of the word muscular, Susan, because it was muscular, but I also might say it might be Trumpian. I mean, the fact they put the sanctions on the day before, the fact that they were so willing to smash mouth in the public forum was in some ways Trumpian. But the thing that you touched on at the end there, what I thought was important, which is it's on different issues. It is not on the trade and economic issues. It's much more on the human rights. It's on the Uyghurs. It's on Hong Kong, things that Trump never talked about, frankly. And it's interesting to me. I think that's an important. Maybe it's nuance, but I think it's important nuance because this gets back to conversations, frankly, that the four of us have had previously in the run up to the administration, which is, Biden and Blinken are very different from Trump and from, frankly, the Obama era in their focus on human rights and democracy promotion, which frankly had gone out of style in Washington since the Iraq War largely. And it was actually, frankly, good to see, U.S. foreign policy at the most senior level making a point on human rights and on democracy promotion, things that I think the U.S. should be standing for more boldly, and hasn't, frankly, even throughout the 8 years of the Obama administration. So I think Susan's exactly right. It was telling that they didn't really push hard on tariffs and trade, and we don't know where they're going to be on that. But I was surprised at how aggressive they decided to be on the human rights issue, because it's something that they could have very easily papered over.
James, watching this from Europe, is this the worst fear come true, in the sense that the United States has basically decided that Asia is the most important area and the Europeans are definitely in second place, and that there is a big confrontation between the United States and China, and the US will come knocking on the door and say, you got to be with us rather than against us in this competition? Is that how it's seen in Europe, or is this theatrics that is part of U.S. diplomacy writ large?
Well, Ivo, let's not let the facts get in the way of a good story. But the unfortunate truth is that Asia is the most important area for U.S. foreign policy. It's the most important area for everyone's foreign policy in the West. And so I don't think there's a sense.
James, you're talking to the former U.S. ambassador to NATO. Be careful. I'm
going to break it to him.
I would agree.
This is a double betrayal. So I don't think that's the issue. And by the way, I don't read it exactly the same way that Peter and Susan do, I should say, because I think that something's happened here that takes you much closer to sort of 1990s post-Tiananmen style US-China policy, and in fact, Western China policy. So we in the UK saw an echo of this without, I should say, the theatrics, and certainly without the sort of, rhetorical standoff. I should say that the British government produced in the UK an extremely boring review of its national security policy titled The Integrated Review. But in it was a deeply interesting choice. In the last 2 to 3 years, you've seen the China hawks in the UK really gain momentum. And they've built it not just around Xinjiang and around Hong Kong, but the personality of Xi Jinping and the perception that Xi Jinping's authoritarian leadership permeates all parts of Chinese activity, including economic. And in the end, what the Integrated Review did was it stood down the China hawks, right? Not in so many words. Of course, it sort of, made very clear that it will stand with them on issues of human rights, on the issues of treatments of the Uyghurs. Boris Johnson's government has actually been very strong on Hong Kong and support of Hong Kong citizens, but it drew a line. And the line that it drew was, we're going to try to have a positive relationship around business and investment. And my read of what's happening in the US is actually something very similar, that there is a foreign policy that's based around principles of democracy and human rights, that the US and China are going to, look each other square in the eye and disagree forcefully on those issues. But around issues of climate change, around issues of the economy, there is something that's much more cooperative that is restarting now.
Susan, I mean, is the same thing happening in and we are missing it in the rhetoric, that there is a more cooperative and a more competitive aspect to the policy, that rather than the confrontational one that the Trump administration was conveying?
So, James, I think you're right to spotlight this as sort of the potential area, the fault line, if you will. I think it's still being fought out. And in fact, that fight has yet to actually probably be joined. Remember that this is very early days, and the way that our sclerotic dysfunctional system works, most of the Biden foreign policy officials aren't even confirmed in their official jobs yet. So I think that this will be the fight. behind the scenes, because largely this has been a pretty disciplined group, but we all know them. And we know that there is a disagreement that is likely to reveal itself. How sharply they will clash, I think, does depend a little bit on what happens and what the Chinese do and say. But, you can see glimmers of it already. John Kerry, the former Secretary of State, has been installed as the climate envoy. Is a very unusual role in the sense that his former deputy is now the actual Secretary of State. And then you have another Secretary of State flying around the world who is one, as we all know, who craves deals and likes to make them, even with people like Russia and China. And I think you'll see Kerry out there being an advocate of the idea publicly that we can, sort of make common cause on these issues, while at the same time, having a much more arm's length, stern discussion about values and human rights. So I think you can already see that he'll be one pole of this conversation, I suspect, and imagine that Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell, who is really shepherding America's Asia policy as the sort of, he's even more than a traditional White House NSC senior director. He's a level above that in terms of his empowerment to shape Asia policy. I don't think he would agree with your characterization and has come around to a much different view. I think that what as I understand it, and Ivo, you may understand it even better, but that Kurt Campbell and Jake Sullivan, what they have in mind is actually a more explicit version of the pivot to Asia, or an Asia first foreign policy that does involve almost an alliance of partners standing against China. I think that they see themselves not as hawks in the sense of Trumpian provoking confrontation in order to, quote, get a better deal. I think that actually Trump was kind of naive, right, in much of his foreign policy views, and, saw things in a kind of reductionist way that just actually doesn't fit the way that certainly China operates in the world. So again, I actually agree with you that these are the emerging fault lines. I just don't think that they've had the fight yet.
Susan, I suppose the answer is, I think, as you say, we don't know, because they're arguing it out. What seemed to me is the shift was that we've had, a few years now where the US administration has weaponized tech policy, trade policy, financial markets, and then asked its allies to weaponize those too. So particularly in the tech space, this has caused real stresses and strains, and it's drifted now into the whole world of intellectual property, university campuses too. And what it felt like to me was that in the direct relationship with China, there was a signal of a shift. I'll tell you where I'm really confused, and I'm totally intrigued to try and learn how Kurt Campbell in particular thinks about this, is the tribute countries. Is what an old China would call the countries that surround it. So the reason Myanmar is so complicated and significant to me is within its own rights, within its own history, what's happening there is so significant, but also on the question of whether or not the US and China can come to some agreement about how the world is run. It seems to me that is the first case, and an incredibly difficult one, and it could cut straight into Belt and Road and into the whole question of China's influence. And just to say one thing, forgive me, I was really struck. I was on a call with John Kerry, before Christmas, so this was before his appointment. It was really striking to me, the way he sometimes sort of meanders into his point. He's getting going, you're thinking, oh, this is interesting, where we go? Oh, and then suddenly it lands. And it was really striking to me how forceful he was on the idea of trying to negotiate some kind of future settlement on net zero with China, but how adamant he was that China was exporting its coal problem along the Belt and Road, and that there was one thing for China to improve its numbers within the People's Republic of China, but look at its overall footprint. And in that sense, I think that he'll probably sit between both of those camps.
Let me if I could just disagree with James very quickly, mostly because I enjoy disagreeing with James on the economic bits of it, because I think you're right on climate, but on the economics bits of it, I think what again, Susan's right in that we haven't actually seen what has happened yet because the fight hasn't happened yet. But I really do think the politics of China has changed so much domestically, economically, that there is no way that they can be sort of tough on China, muscular on China, on human rights and democracy, and somehow be more conciliatory on the economic side. I just think Midwest, big industrial states, it is toxic right now, China still. And I think the politics of it have made it such that there is no way that they can be more accommodative towards China on the economics. The way that, as you say, Britain has been, I would say Germany as well. I mean, most of the time I have, we've talked about this before, David Cameron going to Beijing, Angela Merkel going to Beijing with these huge sort of business delegations, not bringing up anything geopolitical, just please buy our stuff, right? That has basically been where the big powers of Europe have been with regard to China until, as you mentioned, James, the recent review in Britain. I think in general, Europe needs China as an export market more than the US does. And as a result, they're more inclined to be passive, for lack of a better word, economically. I don't think that Biden will land there. Again, the fight is still to be had, but I do think the issue has become so toxic domestically that there is no way that the Biden administration can maybe roll back a bit from where Trump is, but I don't think you're going to see a huge rollback on the economic and trade front.
Yeah, so just, I know, Ivo, you want to move on. I just two finger here. The domestic politics explains a lot about the public confrontation as well at this meeting. And by the way, it's very useful to Biden to have the Chinese yelling at them. And that may well be why both sides actually privately end up thinking this is a good meeting. Donald Trump toxified many things, including almost all aspects of our national security and foreign policy. And so taking the politics out of that is unfortunately not a short-term goal for this new Biden team. But I don't think the possibility that you mentioned of China and the US kind of sitting down and coming up with a new condominium, that's not going to hunt anymore. I think that debate actually is over in Washington, and I don't think that it's going to happen. I know John Kerry wants to make deals. Good luck to him, I think.
I'll tell you one thing that's interesting, just also on the politics of it, is, and this is one of the things I find incredibly hard to read, is whether or not Xi Jinping's policy is working for him. So on the one hand, you can easily make the argument that they're seeing off the possibility of an independent Taiwan. They're consolidating their position in Hong Kong. Clearly within the party, he's particularly strong. And then in addition to that, you'd have to say that, the Uyghur policy, as terrible as it is not really costing him at this stage. So there's a version of what Xi Jinping is doing where you say it all works. And then you think how fragile it looks, in that very easily between now and the end of next year, you could see not just political opinion moving, but public opinion moving. And suddenly you ask yourself, do you have a Winter Olympics problem for China that Russia had in 1980? Do you have the kinds of turn in public opinion that make things really difficult? And I just can't read it. I can't read whether or not things are going to continue to move incrementally, and so incrementally that while the nature of China's relationship with its own people and its region fundamentally change, nothing stops it, or whether there's a trigger moment that really does galvanize exactly, I suppose, what you're talking about, this coalition of democracies that serve as some kind of containment to Xi Jinping policy.
So I think this discussion has been a really good reminder to everyone that that foreign policy takes place at two different levels. So there is the strategic policy level, and you can try to be as subtle in your approach as possible and not talk about confrontation, but talk about competition, which could have win-win outcomes rather than zero-sum outcomes, which is, I think, where most of the Biden people are inclined. But the domestic politics says, no, it's full-on confrontation across the board. And I think the same is true for Xi Jinping. I think, James, bringing the domestic politics of China into here, yes, on a foreign policy sense, he is winning. And, he's scoring points, I think is probably the way to put it, whether it's in the South China Sea in Hong Kong with the Uyghurs, he's not paying a big price. But in the meantime, he's got problems at home. And there are big divisions internally about the degree to which the state needs to control capitalism or the private market needs to do so. And if he fails to deliver, his position will be weakened. And so domestic politics, it seems to me, forces the confrontation at the same time that leaders at the top are trying to figure out how to manage it, because confrontation in the end is not good for anybody. But that's a story that will continue for weeks, and it is as Tony Blinken said, the test of the 21st century geopolitics. So we will come back to it, but this was a really insightful by all of you. Thank you so much. Let me switch, James. You already mentioned the integrated review, and this is the much awaited sort of statement from the British government about the self-conception of Britain post-Brexit, I guess, is the way to put it. Where is Britain going? If you can summarize Biden as going Asia first, I guess Britain is going global first. At least if you read the text. What did we learn from the integrated review, and what's the debate that has happened in the UK immediately following its publication?
So Ivo, this is, even by our standards, a particularly silly exercise. And I don't mean the integrated review. I mean you asking me questions about Britain's national security policy. If I remind you, the way that typically this whole process works is I call you and say, what do you think of Britain's national security policy? So I'm going to have a quick go at this, but then I am going to turn the tables on you, because I really do want to know what you think. I mean, the reality is that of itself, it's an extremely important moment for the UK, because so much of its relationship with the world has been governed entirely by an internal argument as regards Brexit. And even the argument about Brexit wasn't really about the relationship and the mechanisms by which, Britain operates in the world. So this is a moment after the fact where Britain, organizes its thoughts. And actually, as a piece of work, it was done by a man called John Bew. It is actually, it's impressive in its judgment, and it's impressive in the way in which it sought to communicate those things. If you sort of met me in the pub and I said, oh, what was the integrated review? It's pretty short in that it's upped the cap on nuclear warheads, right? Which seems odd given that the real threats are cyber pathogens. It's allowed itself room to decrease its number of serving members of the army, although it hasn't actually committed to that. It's, as I said, it stood down the China hawks in that it hasn't marshaled economic and trade policy in the service of a more competitive policy with China, but it has made clear that it sees China as a competitor, not just to its values, but to its prosperity too. And it's really zeroed in on Russia. And it's very clear about the threat of Russia and the malicious nature of Russia within Europe and the UK. Anyone who was traumatized by Brexit will be disappointed by this review, because it skipped through the relationship with the European Union and doesn't see much for it. I think the interesting thing is that its timing, what are we now, not quite a couple of months into the inauguration. What's really clear is that it does embrace multilateralism. It does see those forms as really important, whether it's NATO, whether it's the UN, commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals. The one final point I'd make is that one of the issues here is the kind of looking both ways on the pandemic, really clear about COVAX and the extent to which multilateralism on health policy is essential, and yet at the same time so consumed by the debt that we've ramped up that it doesn't fix the problem of its 0.7% commitment to aid. So I know that sounds like a laundry list, but the nature of these national security policies, they're a little like that. But I wondered, seriously, Ivo, what do you make of it?
I'm going to turn that to Peter. Peter, how do you? I'll come back. I'll come back.
I'm curious to ask Ivo the same question as well, because I always found the U.S. approach to Britain's nuclear capability to be an odd one, in that, in one sense, because it's an ally, and frankly, because the U.S. in many ways maintains the nuclear deterrent, they want Britain to have a nuclear deterrent. On the other hand, if you talk to the Pentagon anyway, on what it would like Britain to do, it is the things that James was talking about: help us with cyber, help us with boots on the ground, help us with deployability. And it's, if you're going to say here are resources that are finite, why would you put it in nuclear, which doesn't seem particularly relevant in the current threat environment, and not put it on the more deployable forces and ISR and that kind of thing?
And Peter, just to be clear, one thing, I also wonder whether or not it's one of those moments where, that thing you've never heard of, we're not doing it. So it's like we've got 180 warheads, we've increased the cap to 260. It may be the case that nothing happens on that front. So it's posturing, but without necessarily delivery. And we're very unclear on that.
Yeah. It's a huge chunk of Britain's defense spending, though. And I always sort of thought if you took that money and bought another aircraft carrier, is that not perhaps better spent? The other thing I just wanted to say, which James highlighted, which I just wanted to ask him about, which is the focus on Russia and the complete ignoring of the EU seems to be odd. Because, again, I always said that Brexit is a tragedy both for Britain and for Europe, because Britain in Europe stiffens Europe's backbone on Russia. You have Merkel now sort of standing alone with the Poles and the Baltics sort of in their sort of, Russia sanction policy. The French and the Italians would love to get back to doing business with the Russians at this point. And it's a bit tragic that Britain is no longer in the room to help the Germans on this front. How do you actually have a coherent anti-Russian policy without getting Europe on board? Because again, it gets back to this whole, losing an empire without finding a role. Britain is now a mid-level power. They cannot on their own, without the Germans and others, do actually an effective anti-Russian policy. Obviously, they have Washington to fall back on, but it just seems to me a bit short-sighted to try to come up with Russia is our singular biggest threat, and actually we're going to ignore the EU. It just seems like a very short-sighted kind of approach.
Ivo?
Jump in here and sort of from Washington. Honestly, I guess the integrated review may have dominated the newspapers and the news in the UK. I'm not sure it penetrated the bubble in Washington, but it is an important relationship that we've long had with the UK, certainly on the intelligence and communication and cyber side and others. How do you read what the UK is trying to do here?
Well, a couple thoughts about it. First of all, I think you're right that it is not front and center, but certainly occupies arguably outsized attention still in Washington relative to its importance. Although you also have heard, in recent years, a lot of people said to me, well, the real special relationship in Europe is not actually with Britain anyways, it's with Germany. And the question of whether Germany and frankly, whether Britain not answered yet by this security strategy. And I think that's partially because we still operate in this very siloed world. Even in a conversation like this, in the last few years, I've done a lot of thinking about this. And part of our problems is that, the quote unquote national security conversation tends to be, and to feel, frankly, in the middle of this global pandemic, increasingly divorced from the actual national security situation, whether it's Britain or the United States. I think it's an enormous problem that we tend not to address that goes far beyond, what is in general a large, but in the end, ultimately, how consequential military that the UK is going to have. In the United States, when more than 500,000 people are dead, more than all combat deaths in the previous century, from catastrophic failed decision making, by a political leadership and a political system that's become so sclerotic. Okay, well, we can have a conversation. I think that the nuclear piece is particularly interesting. What does strategic even mean? That tends to be a synonym for nuclear capabilities. I just spent a week traveling around the US with the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff. And probably the most interesting part of that trip was a visit to Colorado Springs and the brand new Space Command, which they're just setting up. Although there's a big fight because Trump at the last minute said they were going to move that from Colorado to Alabama, a more reliably Republican area. And even a lot of the people at the Space Command said, we're not going to Alabama, which is interesting. But more importantly, our definition in the US military and also in the British and European militaries is to make strategic a synonym with nuclear. And that is obviously already outdated from my trip. And that really, I have to say, it kind of scared the bejesus out of me. Basically, strategic, until we start thinking about that conversation as being both cyber and, unfortunately, space as well as nuclear. it's no longer probably a conversation that reflects the reality of the world that we're already living in, not even some future world. So maybe that's a little too high altitude, Ivo, but I think that's the context in which I would look at the conversation about is it going to be global Britain or not?
Can I just jump in here, and as much as it pains me, defend Britain on this point, because I actually do think sometimes we underestimate the special relationship when it comes purely to defense and security and intelligence. Because look, yes, Germany in many ways is a more reliable ally on the international stage. Not reliable is the wrong word, but actually potentially a future ally on the international stage, particularly when it comes to economics and sanctions, stuff like that. But if you spend any time within, in the Pentagon or in the U.S. intelligence agencies, what you realize is there are many situations where you're in where the American in Islamabad in a particularly important job is actually a Brit. Right. And this is the interchangeability between the British military and British intelligence and American. I think it benefits Britain more than it benefits the US, to be perfectly blunt with you. But it is almost interchangeable in that regard. And as a result, what Britain does militarily should be important to the US, because in almost every single conflict that COVID will end and we would go back to traditional national security threats. In almost every single instance where the US needs an ally to either go to war or do something unspoken on the intelligence side, it is always Britain that is the partner there. And we saw that, frankly, when the Snowden revelations came out, that Britain was doing some of the dirty work for the US on listening to people and whatnot, but clearly even on the kinetic end of the spectrum, as the Pentagon calls it, the war fighting, the ability of Britain to bring a couple, 3, 5 brigade size units to a theater, the U.S. counts on that. And so I think there should be a bit more, defending the special relationship on that security and defense side.
Yeah, James, and I'm not going to ignore your question.
Go on. I want to hear your answer.
So I'll take. I think I find it incomprehensible why a document like this would let itself be diverted by the issue of how many nuclear weapons you may have in the gap. Because in fact, the document on the strategic level is actually quite good on the importance of science and technology, of thinking through on the cyber piece, on the space piece. It's very, in Susan's rightly pushed, let's think about strategic beyond nuclear in a larger way. It actually lays that well out. And then it plops in the middle of the document 3 pages on the nuclear deterrent that frankly everyone has forgotten about. Other than if you cared about whether Scotland will become independent or not, because the British deterrent is located in Scotland. And the reality is, I've spent more time of my life thinking through whether on nuclear weapons and issues. The reality between 225 or 180 and 260 warheads really just doesn't add up to that big a deal. Yes, I can defend one form or the other, but I don't understand it. And what it does is it diverts attention from the self-definition of what Britain's role is. Because if Britain's role is being a member of the P5 and having nuclear weapons, that's a 1945 characterization of what Britain's role is. If Britain's role is the reliable country that tries to maintain an open trading system, a strong a defense of democratic values, working with partners, dealing with cyber and space and other issues, it actually has something to say and being willing to work with everybody, which is why I'd take those 3 pages and I would have spent it on the relationship to the European Union. And I think everyone, they would have been better off. So I think the document is actually quite good. It has a lot of good stuff in it. And it stepped on their own toes by having this issue, which really is, it's important. I don't want to deny its importance, but it didn't have to be in this document in this way.
But annoyingly, Ivo, you've actually also identified the undercurrent that explains it, which is the next big argument within the UK is about the union itself. And so in the way in which all policy for years was dominated by Europe, all policy, including national security policy, then gets put through the lens of, if you're the Conservatives, saving the union. I would just say one thing, which I'm going to spend quite a lot of time thinking about. We used to have a rule, Susan, at my old office, that if someone had a proper idea, it was such a rare thing, someone actually had a proper idea, that they could take the rest of the day off. And I thought that your point that for so long, strategic relationships or strategic thinking has been as a euphemism or a byword for nuclear. And what happens if that is strategic is replaced by something else in terms of cyber or space. And I think that Ivo's point is that while there's a really good body of thinking about the UK's strength in that area, it's not articulated as succinctly as that. Because if it were, you would really be thinking not about Faslane, where the nuclear warheads are, but about Cheltenham, where GCHQ and its signal intelligence operations are, and how do you build on those strengths? And that, I think, is a really significant thought. And I think it will also shake out what kind of partnerships the US has in the West in the next decade.
Susan, you can't take the day off yet, but
me that James can too. We're good.
Oh God, now I have to come up with a good idea now. You guys are pressure.
But look, my final point that I would to elaborate on that, because I do think it is actually a conversation that should be had more than it is, even if we're not, pulling it as far forward as we can. It strikes me that the conversation we're having about Britain, and it's a little bit different with the US given its enormous capabilities, and resources, because it's an existing stakeholder, right? We naturally default to, okay, well, it is a nuclear power, so what's the future of it? Think about those places like the UAE is going to space. Why? Because it's not an existing stakeholder in the previous era of, great power relations. And, who are going to be the new powers of these drone warfare? It's probably not going to be Britain and France, because they're still busy wondering if they can have an aircraft carrier,
Yeah.
And I do think that that's the thing that, I know you can sort of like spend all night, getting like freaked out by, like reading novels about 2034 and, kind of like future of warfare stuff, but it stands to reason, and I think we're seeing it, that there's a sort of a security catechism and, a priesthood, and pick your metaphor, they're still going to be producing documents that are sort of carefully elaborated or not so carefully elaborated, incremental changes from the previous status quo. And
it's an interesting point, and actually it brings back some memories for me, because it is so clear that what the Pentagon really is a mechanism to get money for platforms. And as you're arguing, Susan, which is they do nothing better than to make sure that the projects that have been in the pipeline for 10, 15, 20 years keep getting funded. I just, as an anecdote, I remember when I was still covering the Pentagon, 10, 15 years ago, and you'd call around to the service chiefs and say, hey, I want to interview you about Iraq, Afghanistan. They would never call you back. I decided I wanted to do a budget story, and every one of them called me back, including the Air Force Chief of Staff, who was like in Afghanistan at the time, called me right back because he wanted to argue about how much money he needed for the budget. And that is what they're incentivized by. And the problem with that, of course, is if you're relying on platforms that were developed 15 years ago, the fact that you're talking about, Susan, space, cyber, there's no program for that. And therefore there's no one lobbying for the money for that. And it does start to worry you that some of the more nimble and new powers that are thinking one generation ahead are actually going to pass us as we build yet another overpriced, fighter plane or destroyer. That is I think a problem with the structure of how we do things in the Pentagon.
Well, and that's how power transitions, of course, happen. That newer powers that are coming up are going to challenge in new areas because they're not going to challenge in the old area. Because that's how they're going to win the competition, and the older powers are just reflecting on the platforms. I think you're absolutely right. The Pentagon is a platform maximizing agency. Its purpose is to maximize the number of dollars you can spend on things that whether it's the aircraft carrier, the F-35, or God knows what else you have, while others are trying to defeat it. And I think if you listen to Admiral Davidson, the head of the Indo-Pacific Command, talking about China being able to take care of Taiwan within 6 years, The reason is because they have invested in capabilities that we are no longer necessarily great at countering, and that's what power transitions are part of it. I think part of the question that Britain is trying to struggle with, which is the integrated review, is what is its role in this new transition, and both from newer powers that are more like it and want to become like the new Britain, as well as the larger competition between the United States and China. And it's a hard question.
I'll just say one thing, Eva. There is an answer to it that's out there. What's weird is that it's not really being pursued, except rhetorically, which is this question of the alliance of the democracies. And I'm really surprised. John Soares, the former head of MI6, wrote a piece for us at Tortoise, and he saw quite a, it looked to me at least, in kind of my own kind of naive way, like quite a clear plan, which was how would you run essentially a Western caucus and an Eastern caucus, one that pulled together kind of key democracies in the US and Europe and the key democracies in the US's relationships in Asia, and use that as a way of dealing with these strategic threats. That seems to me really sensible. It seems to me as though there are opportunities to handle that around the G7 and to move to this D10 grouping. But so far, it seems to me it hasn't really moved around beyond the world of policy think tanks.
No, I think, James, I think you're 100% right. And I think the UK had a golden opportunity to seize the moment, and may still do so, by the way. Some of us were pushing pretty hard for the US to embrace a D10, a G10, whatever you want to call it, to bring in sort of the European democratic allies and the Asian democratic allies together in order to have a more global foreign policy. Yeah. The administration decided that for now it needed to concentrate on the things it's concentrating on, which is fine. But
why did they say why did they say no?
And they're still debating it. Let's put it that way. Okay. But Britain has done a nascent form. It has invited India, Australia, and South Korea to come to the Cornwall G7 meeting. That gets you to the 10. So it's the G7 plus the EU plus 3 Asian countries. And it may well be that Cornwall meeting begins the process of coordinating policy on technology, on cyber, on information, on democracy, on human rights. The Indian presence is an interesting and potentially problematic one, but on trade for that matter. And I do think there is an opportunity here for someone to be a policy entrepreneur. And frankly, Boris Johnson had that opportunity, and the D10's not mentioned in the integrated review. And so if you're going to lay it out, that might be the process.
And by the way, in terms of policy entrepreneurs, the UK needs a new idea, because I think one of the things that we're underestimating in the UK is the extent to which this current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, doesn't have any traction within the White House.
And a new idea that is not about increasing the number of nuclear weapons that you have. And with that, I think we've come to the end of another great discussion. We didn't get to the vaccine discussion, unfortunately, not because it's not important, but because the other issues we discussed just led us down that road. That's the way we do World Review. We have interesting discussions about big issues of the day. And what is a bigger issue than the future of world order, the relationship between China and the United States and its allies than we've just had here today. So I want to thank Susan Glasser, Peter Spiegel, James Harding. Once again, wonderful conversation. Really appreciate your participation and look forward to being back another week for World Review. In the meantime, have a own weekend.
Thanks,
Bye, and thank you.
Bye.